Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Everyday life is filled with interactions between superiors and subordinates. Whether you are up or down the food chain, you have to work with someone who has either more or less power than you. How do you launch a new product when your team can't agree on a basic concept? What do you do when a promotion turns your peers into direct reports? How do you move ahead when you and your boss don't see eye to eye? Join us today to learn how to navigate these potential minefields and apply versatile strategies for negotiating disputes at all levels of an organization. Hello, I'm your guest host, Stephen Kotev, and joining us today for our program entitled Making Conflict Work, 7 Strategies for Leveraging Conflict with Your Supervisors and Subordinates is psychologist, professor, and author Peter Coleman. Columbia University professor Peter T. Coleman is a world-renowned expert in the field of conflict resolution, researching, writing, practicing, and teaching on it for over 20 years. His work as a scientist, educator, mediator, and organizational conflict consultant set the stage for his latest book, Making Conflict Work, Harnessing the Power of Disagreement. Dr. Coleman holds a PhD in social organizational psychology from Columbia University, where he today serves as professor of psychology and education and holds a joint appointment in social organizational psychology at Teachers College and the Earth Institute. Dr. Coleman teaches courses in conflict resolution, social psychology, and social science research, and is director of the Morton Deutsch International Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution at Teachers College, Columbia University, chair of Columbia University's Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity, and a research affiliate for the International Center for Complexity and Conflict at the Warsaw School for Social Psychology in Warsaw, Poland. Welcome to the program, Peter.
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we're really glad to have you. And, one of the things that I'm really interested in is you've done a lot. So what drew you to write your latest book, Making Conflict Work, Harnessing the Power of Disagreement?
Well, it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time because probably early in my career when I was a student, I remember people talking at conferences about conflict resolution and cooperative strategies at conflict resolution, and then having students from developing world countries raise their hand and say, right, so it makes sense to cooperate when that's an option for you, but in my situation as a sort of low-power Filipino, I don't have an option. I have to sort of do what I'm told. So what does constructive conflict look like there? And that question, I remember, really stopped me and made me think, wow, that's a big point, that power differences make a huge difference in what feels like cooperation, what you can do, what your options are. And yet the field hadn't really explored it systematically yet. So I did my dissertation in this area a long time ago, and I've studied and worked in this area for a couple of decades, and we felt like we were ready to offer something useful and practical. So my co-author and I, Rob Ferguson, who is a psychologist and an executive coach, spent time talking to a lot of people and organizations and taking the science that I'd done for 15 years and really providing stories and specific tactics and strategies that are based on real-life experience. People, managers, workers, CEOs, people in all different kinds of organizations. There are specific experiences. So it came out of really a need in the field to be able to understand how to navigate conflict across power differences. but then also through our research and through our conversations with people and organizations.
Well, and, it's really funny that you gave your first example, because it just reminds me of a story of, I was giving this presentation on conflict resolution and negotiation to a bunch of prison guards. And they're like, we can't negotiate anything. At least that's what they thought. It's chain of command. What do I do in chain of command? And, your thing of, okay, so here's somebody who's stuck in a system, or stuck in a situation. What do you do? And so, I really applaud you for putting something out there for folks in that situation, because, I think a lot of times that's where a lot of folks are stuck.
Yeah, you feel in roles like that or in positions like that, you feel extremely limited. It's interesting, one of the people we talk about in our book, particularly in the chapter on what we call principled rebellion, is Nelson Mandela, who, as you know, spent 27 years in prison, but when he was in there, was really a master at using different kinds of strategies, like building rapport with the guards so that he had decent relationships, but also using their rules of the prison, and he sort of studied those rules and memorized them, and then he used their rules to control them, and tell them what they could and couldn't do. So he was very facile and creative with finding ways, even in a prison structure where you have, clear, power relationships and a clear hierarchy. Even in a situation like that, he was able to navigate fairly effectively and manage what could have been very violent and brutal conflicts.
And so let's go and talk about those strategies. So you've got 7 strategies. Why don't you go ahead and introduce them? And I don't know what would you prefer, if you want to say all 7 and then talk a little bit about them, or if you want to go and say, hey, here's one, and this is what it is. Whatever your preference is. But why don't you tell us a bit more about these 7 strategies?
Okay, so again, this has all come out of our research, and the research is based on some work that my mentor Morton Deutsch did, like in the 70s, and he kind of set out to say, well, in social relationships and human relationships, are there some ways to understand, like what are the most important aspects of any kind of social situation? Can we, out of all the things that matter when you enter a room and get into a conflict, are there some things that matter most in determining kind of what, how you react to that situation? And he did find a series of things, and 3 are key in conflict. So one is simply, when you're in a conflict, asking yourself, do I need this situation? Is it important to me? Is this relationship important to me? Is this conflict important to me? Because if not, then it might behoove you to not engage with it, to walk away, to find other ways to get your needs met, et cetera. So question number 1 is sort of, does this matter? Question number 2 is the other party or parties, are they sort of with me or against me or some mixed thing? Is this a relationship I have with someone who generally is, trustworthy and cooperative and friendly and we get along most of the time, but we're having a disagreement around something? Or is this a relationship that is chronically kind of competitive and undermining and difficult and contentious, and this is just more of the same? Or is it some combination of both? But it is like reading, are the parties sort of with me or against me, generally speaking here? And then the third question is power. Am I in a situation where I have sort of authority or some type of power over this person? Do they have authority and power over me, or are we, sort of relatively equal? And what we found from our research is those 3 questions. Do I need this situation or this relationship? Are they with me or against me? And who has more power? If you put those together, they create these 7 types of situations, 7 classic types of situations that people face. And what we found is that people are most healthy and happy and satisfied at work if they are able to read these differences in situations and respond in ways that we say fit, respond in ways that we say are adaptive. So let me give you a couple of examples. So it might be that you're in a job that's a difficult job. You've got a boss who likes to be a jerk to you, is oftentimes demeaning to you. You feel like he's very competitive and domineering, and that's sort of his nature. But you sort of need the job, and so despite the fact that you're in low power, despite the the fact that he is demanding and difficult and kind of competitive with you, and despite the fact that you need this job, right, for at least for now, at least for the short term, then given that, that's a situation that we call kind of unhappy tolerance. It's like a situation where you got to sort of suck it up and use this strategy that we call strategic appeasement, which means, okay, so for time being, I got to just make this work, keep my head down, see if I can change the relationship a little bit or change my situation or find other options to get out of here. But for now, I have to kind of just keep my head down, try not to make too much noise, and sort of tolerate this situation until some other options open up. And so that's one strategy that in those difficult situations where that occurs, and it's certainly occurred to me throughout my different careers, it's useful to have that in your pocket. It's not one to use very long. It's not one to get dependent on, but it's definitely one to have to buy some time while you figure out something else. And let me just, I'll give you one more right now to contrast that with a very different kind of situation. So you might have a superior who is generally a nice person. She's warm, she's friendly, she's a good leader, she's smart and organized and very efficient and effective at what she does. And generally speaking, you work for her and you get along very well. You have good relationships, you communicate well. But then you get into a disagreement. And so, and you find yourself in a dispute with that person. So here's a situation where, generally speaking, you feel like she's on your side, and you are in low power, and she has authority or responsibility over you as your supervisor. But you feel like the context of the relationship is usually pretty good, and you like this job. You want to keep this job. So in a situation like that, there's a strategy that we call cultivated support. And that is about when you're in a low-power position like this and working for somebody, that you want to create the conditions where when you have conflict, it's okay. You know that she trusts you, you trust her, you both, respect each other's work, you respect each other's, competencies. And so even if you get into a conflict, you can disagree, you can talk about it, but it's not going to spoil your relationship because you have a strong relationship there. And so that's something that we call cultivated support, which is ideally something you build up over time with a benevolent leader who you work for. So those are two examples of two types of situations, one called unhappy tolerance, unhappy tolerance, where you have to kind of suck it up and use strategic appeasement, and the other, what we call a situation of support or kind of cooperative dependence, where you use where you are dependent on somebody else, but you're generally kind of in a good cooperative relationship. And in those situations, you use something called cultivated support, where you depend on the relationship, you foster a strong relationship so it can tolerate disagreements and disputes, and you can move through them fairly quickly and effectively.
So, okay, so there's three elements that folks need to discern, and one of them is if you've got less power or more power, yep, whether folks are with you or against you. And what was the first one?
And how much do you need the situation? Do you need the relationship?
Yeah, okay.
Do you need the job? Do you need this conflict? Or is it something you can walk away with? Because that one of the key strategies that we really encourage in conflicts, particularly that are unimportant to you, either the relationship doesn't matter, the job doesn't matter, or this particular disagreement is of low importance. In those situations, the strategy that we strongly recommend is selective autonomy, which means get out, pull out, disengage. I don't need this dispute. I don't need to get into it with you. I don't need to, that is often an option for people that they don't consider. Conflicts can rile us. We can lash out emotionally. But if you want to think strategically, the question is, is this important? Do I need to do this? And if not, then one option is to disengage and find another way to do what you need to do.
Well, and it's interesting, listening to how you have everything presented, that a lot of what your work is giving folks that simple sort of metric of, okay, how badly do I need this? How much power do I have? Are folks with me or against me? And then from there, okay, so here are some options for you. And, you've given us two that you talked about: strategic appeasement, and what was the term that you cultivated support, right?
Support, yeah.
Those are the two. Go ahead.
And so what we call selective autonomy.
Right. That was the third one.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Right. And so with these, it sounds like in some sense, some of the strategies are either two sides of a coin, as the first two examples you gave, or in a sense they're like a roadmap. So you're saying, for example, if you've got a situation where, like you just gave us with the selective autonomy, I may or may not really need this. Okay, well, here are some options. So it sounds like throughout your book, you would go and you would map out those options. And before you answer, I just want to remind folks that they're listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk radio program with myself, your guest host, Stephen Kotev. Today I'm joined by Peter Coleman, and we are discussing Making Conflict Work, 7 strategies for leveraging conflict with your superiors, supervisors, and subordinates. So, is that an accurate sort of statement, Peter, that these strategies that you have, each one sort of gives folks direction, and each one gives folks options? That's
exactly what the book does. And really, Charles Darwin, who said it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the more intelligent of our species, but rather the one most responsive to change. And so part of what this whole book is about is that you don't want to have one tool, one way of addressing conflict, one chronic response for all kinds of conflicts, because these differences really matter. If you're negotiating up with a boss or down with an important employee that you work with, or a difficult employee that you work with, or if you're negotiating with your peers, those differences matter. And so it's useful to have options and have different set of strategies. And so what our research identified were these kind of prototypical situations that people tend to face, and the kinds of solutions that effective people use in those situations that work there and that are particularly useful in those types of situations. So the two of the ones that we didn't really talk about in too much detail yet are the sort of high power situations. So I'm in authority. I'm a boss. I'm a manager, or I run a business, and I've got people that work for me. And again, I may be in a situation as a manager where I have a difficult employee, and there's someone that I think does a decent job, and I'd like to keep them if I can, but they're demanding and difficult and kind of peevish and, cause problems that we don't really need. And so there is this more difficult or competitive dynamic with them. And so even though I'm in high power, it feels like we have some incompatible goals. We've got some things, with some problems that we need to resolve, and yet I'd like to keep them there. So the strategy that we talk about in those types of situations is something we call constructive dominance. Now, we think that the idea of dominating people and telling them what to do and things gets a bad reputation sometimes in the conflict resolution world. But what we argue is sometimes you need it. Sometimes you need people to kind of come in clear and strong and say, okay, here's what I need you to do. And this is, we don't really have time to discuss this particular thing. I know you don't want to do it, but it's part of the job, so I please ask you to respect the job and do it. And sort of, so how do you use your authority in, assertive ways that's fair, firm, and clear when you need to, in those situations that you need to. And the distinction from that and from a high-power situation that we make is the situations that we call of benevolence, where, you're a manager, you work with people, and you have an employee who is genuinely a great employee. They show up, they do a good job, they're friendly, they're, communicative, you like them, you value them, and you want to keep them, and then you have a disagreement over something. So again, like the support relationship we talked about earlier, this is kind of the flip side where you're a benevolent manager, but you have someone, suddenly you're in a disagreement with someone who you feel pretty good about, generally speaking. And in those situations, you would want to use what we call, benevolence, which is really, using the conflict as an opportunity to pull them aside, talk to them respectfully, try to understand what's going on with them. Remember, this is not something that they typically do, so there's probably something specific happening here. So what is that? And can you use this conflict, this opportunity, as kind of a moment to, A, model for them constructive conflict resolution, and B, listen to them and learn from them and build a stronger rapport, because you like this employee, you want to work with them. So those are, again, other high-power strategies, what we call constructive dominance and benevolence, that are useful. But one of the things I want to highlight is that all of these strategies have their downsides if you use them too much or if you use them in the wrong situation. So I've had jobs or employers who were really nice people, very friendly people, but they couldn't sort of rein in difficult employees. They couldn't kind of be tough when they needed to. They couldn't sort of step in and stop, sort of childish behavior. And so they started to, they were overly benevolent, and they started to lose the respect of the other employees because they kind of couldn't control their house, And so
right.
What you need is the capacity to respond appropriately to different kinds of situations, and that kind of leadership and that kind of workmanship, I think, really leads to a healthier and happier life.
So let me go over, because you said a couple of things that I think are really important that I want to make sure I catch. And, before I do that, I just want to go through all of the 7, because I think we talked about all of them, but I'm not sure. But for our listeners, I want to give all of them so they at least know what they are. And they're all in your book, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, and how folks can find it, and some of the things you have on the web connected directly to the book. But we've got pragmatic benevolence, cultivated support, constructive dominance, strategic appeasement, selective autonomy, effective adaptivity, and then principled rebellion. I think those are the 2 that we haven't talked about.
Yeah. So
right?
The last 2 are really.
But before you go there, there's one other point that you made that I thought was really, really important that I want to make sure our listeners catch, and that is that this isn't a one-size-fits-all response. That basically you got to take a lay of the land and then pick the right one. If you use one, in some sense, as your only option, that can then also become an anchor to hold you down, going back to the example of the really nice person who couldn't, rein in the difficult employee.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the kind of essence of adaptivity. So the 6th strategy that you mentioned is this idea of adaptivity, and that is the capacity to kind of read situations effectively. In other words, ask yourself, is it important to me? Are they with me, against me? Do I have more or less power here? And then kind of assess the situation and then respond with a strategy that fits there, right? So adaptivity is the capacity to have different kinds of skills to use in these different kinds of situations sufficiently effectively. And the final strategy that we talk about, which is principled rebellion, is this. What this whole approach suggests is that most of the time, in most of the conflicts we face at work, at home, and in our communities, are what we call decent situations, fair situations where, you want to do things that fit and work in those, in those situations, fit and work with the context of, what's expected at work. But sometimes we're asked to do things that are either illegal or immoral or unethical or really unprofessional or just feel wrong. And so what the principled rebellion strategy is when you are asked to do something where responding in a way that fits feels wrong, it feels like it's an illegitimate request, then what are your options? And what we've laid out here is kind of a sequence of tactics where you can sort of slightly, begin by sort of saying no quietly, but then slowly turn the heat up and the volume up so that you communicate clearly, this is a line I won't cross, I'm not okay with this, and even to the extent of perhaps going to outside authorities, if that's necessary. So the last strategy, the 7th strategy, is one of principled rebellion, where you're asked to do things that really cross a moral or ethical line.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting when we hear all of these because, you really have categorized responses that go from, what we would say is best case scenario to worst case scenario, okay, good day, got a good boss. All right, pragmatic benevolence is going to be a nice option. Incarcerated, working for civil rights, named Nelson Mandela. All right, we're going to do principled rebellion. We're going to go take the exact opposite end of the spectrum.
Absolutely. And, one of the reasons we talk about Mandela in the book is because through his life, through his, sort of long-term journey to, opening up South Africa to this, multiracial society, he used all of these strategies. He was a boxer, he was a lawyer, but he also could do consensus, and he was really a diplomat and a leader, and he had good rapport with people, but he could be a tenacious fighter. He would move back and forth and use low-power strategies and high-power strategies through the context of a day, let alone his entire career. And so he really showed that kind of adaptivity and how effective that adaptivity can be, even in a situation as difficult and demanding as apartheid South Africa was. So if he can do that there, imagine what we can do in our jobs.
And, we're just scratching the surface here, and we're starting to come to the end of the program, and to me, I feel like we're just getting started. One of the things I want to check in on is that this concept of effective adaptivity, being adaptive and sort of responding to the situations as necessary, that seems to me to be, a central message for you, not only for leaders, but for everybody. And, I think my question in where I want you to go with your answer is how can everyday folks apply what's in your book to their life?
Well, so one of the things we recommend is that if you either buy the book or go to the website for the book, which is at makingconflictwork.com, there is an assessment there that you can take. It takes you about 20 minutes or so to do it, and that will give you some initial feedback of, well, what are the kinds of strategies that I tend to get trapped in and I tend to use most of the time because they're my go-to or that I'm comfortable with, and what are the kinds of strategies that if I develop them would allow me to sort of feel more adaptive and be more effective at work. And so it's a first step at getting some sense of where you are as an individual and then some sense of what are the specific strategies that I could start to work on. And then, of course, in order to do that, it would be helpful to have our book or to read some of the papers or articles that we have on our website, which will give you some sense of what these things are.
Well, you've, as a scientist, I'm assuming, you've done a lot of research or have accessed a lot of research. From your experience, what has been the sort of most used of the strategies that you know of, and what's been the least used of the strategies?
It depends on what country. So we've done research here in the United States, we've done research in South Korea, we've done research in China, and it varies somewhat. What most people say they do most is benevolence in work settings. Now, I'm a little skeptical about that because I think we tend to over-report that. But what's interesting is, Americans don't like the appeasement idea, and they say that they don't use it. But in South Korea and in China, they use it quite frequently. We do use autonomy. We do use cultivated support, although a little bit less. And we say we don't use dominance that often, and that might be true, but in my experience, plenty of people use dominance when they need to. So again, these measures are only as effective as we can be honest about and reflecting in ourselves and what we sort of really do. But those are the main go-tos that we've found in our research. But the biggest finding we have is that overall, what is most helpful for people is being adaptive. When people are using the right strategies in the right situations, or at least not using the wrong strategies in different situations, they're happier at work, they're emotionally healthier, they have lower intentions to quit at work, less job stress. There are very strong effects if you develop these options and start to use them in your work life.
And so, Peter, what, for our listeners, what would be your call to action for them? You sort of, I think, mentioned a couple of things, but what would if folks want to engage with this further? What's your advice for them?
So I think step number one is to get to know yourself better, and one way to do that is to go to our website, makingconflictwork.com, and on that there is a self-assessment. There's a menu and a tab to a self-assessment. Go on that and check it out. It won't take you that long. It presents you with some situations and says, well, how would you respond in this situation? And then it gives you some feedback about how, what are your kind of chronic tendencies. And that's a place to start. The book has a bunch of short quizzes that give you a little bit more of a sense of this. It has questions that you can use to talk to coworkers or talk to your spouse or talk to your friends and sort of say, all right, this is an area that I think I need to really work on. Give me a little feedback on this. So there are plenty of exercises and things to discuss in the book itself. But the first step is really to start to reflect on you and what are your kind of chronic go-to strategies, and what are the things that if you develop them, you can increase your sense of well-being at work. And that would come from, again, taking this assessment online, and then ideally, if possible, buying the book and taking a look at the specific strategies that you feel would be beneficial to develop.
So makingconflictwork.com, that's the website. So how, other than going to that website, if folks are interested in learning more about you or about the work that you do, how can folks reach you or engage with this further?
So you can, if you Google Peter T. Coleman, I have a website at Columbia I run a couple of centers here, as you had said at the beginning, and so there's a lot of information about the research we do and the courses we offer, and then I write a lot of blogs and op-eds, and those are all listed on there as well. So there's probably way too much information of me if you go to our websites at Columbia, but that's one place to start.
Great. Closing thoughts, closing comments.
Again, I think what's most important is that people don't be discouraged by their challenges with conflict. Conflict can provide opportunities for us to engage with people and grow, learn more about ourselves, make for better relationships. They don't have to go bad. And so this book and really probably this radio program and most of what you do is really about increasing your options and increasing your capacities to make conflict work for you, not against you. And that's really the message. Anybody can do that if you put some work and effort into it.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for being on our program. I really feel that even with our brief period of time, you've given us some good insights into how to look at things and how to think about things that we may not have had before. So thank you so much for being on the program today.
Stephen, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.
Have a good day, Peter.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.